I thought I was participating in a space where I could learn, unlearn, exchange knowledge, and be myself. But somewhere along the way, the experience started teaching me something much bigger: how we choose, how we interpret, how we communicate, how we know ourselves, and how we recognize what's actually for us. And maybe that's the experiment, not an experiment on people, an experiment in experience. Why I chose the space. The space described itself as open quote. This is an inclusive space where we can collectively heal, learn, and unlearn. Close quote. And the host said that verbally too. So I took that seriously. I didn't hear inclusive and think everybody has to agree with me. No, I heard there is room here for different perspectives. I thought this was a place where I could bring my experiences, my culture, my questions, my way of thinking, and other people could do the same. I had been participating in this space for about 2 years, and the conversations were often about things that mattered directly to me: Blackness, culture, identity, relationships, Pacific Islanders, migration, erasure, how people perceive one another, how people categorize one another. So I had a reason to believe I could participate authentically. And by authentically, I mean as myself. Knowledge of self, I am Papuan. My ancestors come from Papua New Guinea. Culturally and ethnically, my people are categorized within Oceania, specifically Melanesia, rather than African ancestry. So when I identify myself as Papuan, Melanesian, or Aboriginal Indigenous, I'm not separating myself from Blackness. I'm identifying myself accurately. And that distinction became very important to me because I present phenotypically as Black. People often look at me and assume I'm Asian or Asian mixed. And that experience has made me very aware of something. There is a difference between what I am, what I look like, and what somebody else thinks I am. Those are not necessarily the same thing. And culturally, I operate on standards, rules, not exceptions. One of those standards is self-identification, knowing who you are, naming yourself, and reminding people that your people are still here. So when conversations about Pacific Islanders and Blackness came up, I wasn't going to sit silently while people discussed my people, as though there wasn't somebody in the room who could actually speak from that experience. The conversations about Blackness. There was a Black male panelist who regularly brought up Pacific Islander people's relationship to Blackness. He questioned things like, why do some PI people use the N-word? Why do they assimilate? Why do they relate to Blackness? Why do they participate in Black culture while not identifying as Black? And it wasn't simply curiosity. He made it clear that he didn't like the behavior he was describing. And I found that interesting because I was sitting right there. I'm the person on the panel who identifies as Papuan, Melanesian, Aboriginal Indigenous, and presents phenotypically as Black. So when he talked about PI people and Blackness, I would contribute my perspective, not because I expected him to agree, but because if we're talking about my people, I have knowledge to contribute. But eventually, I realized something. My distinction was being interpreted as separation, almost as though saying I am Papuan meant I am not Black. But those are not necessarily the same statement. I can tell you where my ancestors come from. I can tell you my ethnic and cultural identity. I can acknowledge that I present phenotypically as Black. And I can discuss my relationship to Blackness. Those things can coexist. What became uncomfortable for me was realizing that while I was trying to identify myself, I felt like I was being identified by other people. And that distinction matters because I wasn't separating myself from them. I was refusing to let someone else erase the identity I was naming for myself. The Oakland conversation. There was a conversation about demographics across different locations. The Black male panelist said he didn't realize Oakland was that diverse, and I added my perspective, because demographics on paper don't necessarily tell you what a place actually looks like or feels like. There's a difference between what the demographic chart says and what people actually see. There's identity, phenotype, presentation, perception, categorization, and lived experience. So I wasn't changing the subject, I was adding the why. But I began noticing that when I added those layers, I was sometimes told, that's not the topic, or they don't care. And eventually, when it came to certain subjects, particularly my culture, And connecting Asian or Pacific Islander identities to Blackness, I realized those were areas where I consistently couldn't speak freely. And that mattered because those were precisely the areas where I had something specific to contribute. The date story. Then something happened that really made me stop and look at myself. I had told a story about a date. The man had sent me altered photos. I asked him about the photo. He denied that it was altered. But I edit and alter photos myself. I know what I'm looking at. So I jokingly said, "That man is expensive." And by expensive, I didn't mean that he was valuable. He was expensive because entertaining that situation was going to cost me my eyesight, my hearing, and my skills. I could see what I was seeing. I could hear what I was hearing. And I had the skills to recognize what was happening. So why would I pay the price of abandoning my own perception just to accept somebody else's version of reality? And of course, I can't actually know what he was thinking. But his behavior made me feel like I was being asked to distrust what I could literally see. And that's what made him expensive. The prompt. Then the host put up a prompt. Can you be with someone who lies to you? Everyone was supposed to answer yes or no, but we were allowed to expand. And I answered yes. But then I said, I watch people lie to themselves all the time. And I basically said, I can be around people who lie. People lie all the time. Even something as simple as, how was your day? Sometimes that's just an automatic greeting. The person may not actually be asking for a detailed account of your emotional state. It's a social interaction. And that's where my attention went to the actual language. Be with. In the way I understand and use the language culturally, be with can mean being around someone, spending time with someone, being in their company. You hear things like, I'm finna go be with my friends, or I'm gonna be with my mom. It's about presence, time, association. So when I heard, can you be with someone who lies to you? I was paying attention to the construction. Can you be with someone who lies to you? I wasn't automatically translating that into, would you remain in a romantic relationship with a dishonest person? I was answering the question through the language framework I actually speak. And that's when she told me I was centering myself. And I remember thinking, wait, what? The moment I questioned my comprehension, at that point, I genuinely wondered, do I have a comprehension problem? So I stopped talking. I asked her in the comments if she was serious about saying I couldn't speak to the prompt. She said yes. And I asked, why didn't you just establish that boundary when you put the prompt up? Because if the rule was answer yes or no, but don't expand through your own experiences or interpretation, I could have understood that. I could have decided whether I wanted to participate. I could have left. But you can't put the responsibility on me to know a boundary that wasn't communicated. I don't operate on assumptions. I read the room. I read the label on the room. I read the welcome message. I listened to the host repeatedly describe the space as inclusive. I heard the language about healing, learning, and unlearning. I heard the reminders about making room when people are uncomfortable. So I was operating based on what was actually being communicated. And that was the moment I really started noticing the pattern. Expectation versus experience. I realized something. I entered the space expecting to learn more, and I began to wonder if the space was actually operating from an expectation that people would simply understand more. Those are not the same thing. If you're expecting to learn, you're making room for knowledge you don't already possess. If you're expecting to understand, you may already believe you have the framework, and you're trying to explain the subject through it. That's a huge difference because I wasn't entering the room thinking I already know everything. I was entering thinking there are things I don't know, let me learn. But I also came with knowledge. And if the space says we're going to share knowledge, then my knowledge has to be allowed to exist in the room too. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to agree, you can reject it. But you can't call something a space for learning and then prevent information from being shared because it challenges the existing understanding. Because then, what are we actually learning? The anti-Blackness. This is where I began understanding my experience as anti-Blackness. Because I wasn't simply experiencing disagreement. I was experiencing restrictions around my culture and my relationship to Blackness, while other people were allowed to discuss and characterize those same subjects. And I'm looking at the room. Everyone else is Black, Black presenting or identifying as Black. Several are Caribbean, there are Black Americans, and then there's me, the Papuan, Melanesian, Aboriginal Indigenous person who is Black presenting. So I'm looking at the dynamics of what I started thinking of as the Black gate, not a literal gate, a social one. The gatekeeping of who gets recognized as Black, who gets to define Blackness, who gets to be inside the category, and who has to explain why they are there. Because when a Black presenting Pacific Islander is sitting in the room and says, I am telling you about my people, and that knowledge is rejected before it can even be explored, that's not just an intellectual disagreement to me. That's cultural invalidation. And when that happens around Blackness and Black presenting people, I think it's fair to call the action what I experienced it as anti-Blackness, the prototype of Blackness. And that led me to an even bigger question. What is Black? What is Blackness? Because we're all going to understand those words differently. But before we even get to identity, think about what happens when you hear the word Black. You probably get an image, a person, a phenotype, a cultural presentation, maybe a particular historical experience. That image is the prototype, the example you've been taught to recognize first. But the prototype isn't necessarily the entire category. And that's where things become complicated. Because when someone doesn't look like the prototype, we start asking, are they really Black? Are they mixed? Are they Asian? Are they Pacific Islander? Can they be Black presenting without being Black? Who gets to decide? That's where I started thinking about the difference between what I am, what I look like, and what you think I am. Those are three different things. I identify as Papuan and Melanesian. My ancestors come from Papua New Guinea. People often perceive me as Asian or Asian mixed, and I present phenotypically as Black. All three things can exist at the same time. And that is exactly why I think we have to be careful about confusing the prototype with the definition. Language is part of the experience. And then I had to examine something else. Language. Because even when we're all speaking English, we're not necessarily bringing the exact same linguistic framework to the conversation. I choose my words based on the audience I'm speaking to. Sometimes I'm answering within more than one linguistic and cultural framework at the same time. So when I hear a phrase like be with, I'm bringing the meaning I've learned through my own culture and dialect. That doesn't mean somebody else can't interpret it differently. It means language carries culture. The words may be English, the meaning isn't always culturally neutral. And that became part of my self-awareness too. What I learned about myself. This entire experience became bigger than the question of whether the space was inclusive. Because I started asking, what did this experience teach me about myself? I learned that I'm a systems thinker. I connect things. I don't naturally stop at the first layer. I hear demographics and I think identity, presentation, perception, categorization, lived experience. I hear be with and I think about being, existing, presence, time, association. That's how I process information. And I learned something else. My depth isn't necessarily confusion. Sometimes I'm simply following the structure of the question. Sometimes I'm operating through more than one linguistic or cultural framework at the same time. Sometimes I'm answering what the words mean to me before I ever get to the larger philosophical question. And knowing that about myself matters, because once you know how you think, you can recognize when a communication mismatch is happening, the experiment. And that's when I realized maybe this really was an experiment, not an experiment on people, an experiment in self-awareness. I had an expectation. I chose the space. I participated. I brought my identity. I brought my culture. I brought my language. I brought my way of thinking. And then I watched what happened. The experience became the information, expectation, participation, observation, reflection, learning. And now I know more, not only about the space, about myself, knowing what's for you. And that brings me to the bigger question. How do we know what's for us? Sometimes we choose something because of what it says it is: inclusive, safe, healing, educational, community. But eventually, you have to experience it because a label tells you what something claims to be. Participation tells you what it actually allows. And that doesn't necessarily mean the choice was a mistake. The choice gave you information, and information gives you better choices. That's self development, that's self awareness. That's how we learn why we choose what we choose. Sometimes we don't know what is for us until we experience what isn't. So now when I think about that space, I don't only ask, was it inclusive? I ask, what did my participation reveal about the space, about culture, about Blackness, about language, about perception, about identity? And most importantly, about me. Because knowing yourself means more than knowing what you call yourself. It means knowing how you think, knowing what standards you operate by, knowing what language means to you, knowing what you need in order to participate fully, knowing what you're willing to learn, and knowing when something you're experiencing is giving you information about what belongs in your life. Maybe that's the real experiment. We choose, we participate, we observe, we reflect, we learn. And then we choose again with more information than we had before. CTA. So I want to leave you with a question. Have you ever chosen a space, a relationship, a community, a job, or an environment because of what you thought it was, and then discovered something completely different once you actually participated? And even more importantly, what did that experience teach you about yourself? Tell me in the comments, because maybe the thing you thought you were studying was actually teaching you who you are. And if this conversation made you examine one of your own experiences differently, subscribe. We're going to keep exploring self awareness, identity, perception, language, and why we choose what we choose.